And the overall theme of what we're going to be looking at are scenes and themes from the Gospels. But the first and the last lesson in this series, I want us to think about some things that are outside of the Gospels particularly, but relate to the things that we read about in the Gospels. And so I want to start this series of lessons by thinking through how God's grace is supposed to strengthen us. And the things that we're going to see in the Gospels, beginning in the worship service and then at 2 this afternoon and Monday and Tuesday, are all going to help us flesh some of these ideas out more and more. Let me give you a little bit of my background as we get into this lesson. I understand a lot of you know Rick Lanning. In fact, when I was getting this my PowerPoints on this computer here, I thought I saw a PowerPoint that Rick Lanning did with a big smiley face. Would that look like something he did? So I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was converted there when I was 19, and I was going to the church at Northwest as a new convert. And my mom and dad are not Christians. I didn't grow up in a Christian family that read the Bible or believed the Bible, anything like that. And I remember having a lot of struggles and challenges of getting good answers to the questions that they had, but they didn't ever want to hear the answers that I was learning. And so I would go to Northwest, and I'd be crying and bawling, trying to figure out why I was being persecuted for trying to do the right thing. And people at church would sometimes make a statement like this, and ask yourself if you've ever heard this statement before. I know that this is really hard, but you have to rely on God's grace. You have to be strengthened by the grace of God. That's a phrase that when you hear that, there's no way that you would ever disagree with it or challenge that at all, because we know that we have to agree with that. But the thing that I would always wonder is, what does that mean to find strength from God's grace? How do I rely on God's grace? And that's what I want to talk about in this first session here. But if there's a strength that comes from God and His grace, that presupposes that there's a variety of different kinds of strength that exist in the world. So if we were to think about just other kinds of strength that exist in the Bible, you could think about Samson, for example. What's the evidence or the proof that Samson was strong? And I'm okay if you guys want to chime in here.
By his feet, the things he did. Right?
Yeah, picking up giant fences and carrying them different places and tying foxes' tails together. You ever tried doing that? I mean, that'd be really hard. So he could lift really heavy things. By the way, what was his biggest spiritual downfall? It was lust. What happened to his eyes? They were gouged out, plucked out. I think that's when he started to walk by faith. But you could tell that he's strong because he can lift heavy things. All right, what about this one? The rich young ruler. And there's lots of rich people in the Bible. What's the evidence that somebody has financial strength? You got money. You're a mover and shaker. You can kind of get your way, and you're used to getting your way because people are hoping that they can get some money from you. What about political strength? Remember Jeroboam? He becomes the king of the north, and the first thing he does with his political strength is he makes worship centers in Dan and Bethel. How do you know that you have political strength? Well, you can change laws, and you can raise taxes, and you can do things like that. What about intellectual strength with King Solomon? People could come from all over the world, the Queen of Sheba, and she's got these challenging questions that she wants to ask Solomon, and Solomon is able to answer all of these questions. So those are different kinds of strength. How many of us in this room are going to have any one of those kinds of strength in abundance? You remember in 1 Corinthians, not many of you were wise according to the world, not many of you were powerful according to the world. I don't think any of us are going to have just large amounts of any of this. You don't meet many people that do. But there is a strength that's available to all Christians, and that is this spiritual strength. What's the evidence that you've been strengthened by God's grace? And I'm curious what you guys would say about that question. What was that?
We have peace.
Okay, good. You'd have peace. What else?
Empathy.
Yeah, empathy.
We show others grace.
You're showing it to others.
We're gentle.
Yeah, with gentleness. What about withstanding trials and not giving in or falling away when hardships come? Like you have a certain kind of strength to stand. We're going to talk about that in the last lesson of this series with Job. But another evidence that you have spiritual strength is that you're continually growing in your holiness, that you're not coasting, but that you keep growing. And so I want us to see this passage in 1 Corinthians 15, and this is where Paul is commenting on the gospel and what Jesus has accomplished. And look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We're going to read verses 8 through 11. This is in the context where Paul is saying that Jesus appeared to the other apostles, and then look at verse 8. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. I want to really unpack in this session this idea of the grace of God was working in me. Now, I want to think about the work that Paul did. You notice how in this passage he talks about how he worked harder than any of the other apostles? I don't think he's saying that to denigrate or downgrade the other apostles. Maybe what he means is he went to more areas than the other apostles and started more churches. He's emphasizing either way that he was a zealous worker for God. What was some of that work that he did? Well, he was preaching and teaching. And how many of you men preach and teach here are in a rotation? Okay, so you guys know that like you have to get the lesson ready, and they're never as easy to get ready as you think it's going to be, and then you pour your heart out into it. You're doing all, and you have to be on, and you have to make sure that you're mentally aware of everything that's going on. And so and a lot of you guys also have to support yourself with you don't have a fully supported preacher here. So you know the struggle of working during the week and then trying to get lessons ready. Paul had to make tents. And while he was preaching and teaching and then making tents on the side, not all the time, sometimes he was fully supported, everywhere he went just really loved him, right? He had no issues. Look at in 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 25. He says that he had countless beatings, was often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. All right, in this passage, how high can Paul count? He can count to 5 at least. Do you see that in verse 24? All right, so Paul can at least count to 5. Do you see at the beginning of this quote, countless beatings, often near death? And then I'm going to give you some numbers of some other things that happened. How many times was he beaten if we know he can at least count to 5? How many times was he often near death if he can at least count to 5? It's more than 5 is the idea. So he's preaching and teaching and he's doing all this work, and then he's writing things like Galatians and he's writing Romans. How many of you like writing long emails? I do not enjoy doing that. And so Paul's writing Romans, and that would have been and while he's doing that, he's also training Timothy and Titus. I have a training program. I've trained 6 guys now. I've got a guy that I'm working with right now. There's other guys that I've worked with. And that's not easy because they keep coming with questions, and I'm trying to do my own work, but I've agreed to help these guys. So he's doing all of that. All right, so do you notice in this passage when Paul talks about he works harder than all the other apostles, he's really quick to say what's motivating him. In verse 10, it was the grace of God that was with him. Which means this, that while Paul's preaching and teaching and he's writing letters and he's enduring all the persecution, he's not thinking to himself, everybody's going to remember me as some great preacher. He's not thinking in terms of eventually, after I've done all of this, I'm going to build this great legacy. He's not thinking in terms of, I'm going to keep helping other people as long as they're helping me. Instead, he gets stoned, he gets shipwrecked, he gets beaten, and he goes into another town. And what's on his mind is what, according to verse 10? God's been good to me, I can do nothing else. You could ask yourself the question, if you're not working hard for the Lord, you don't understand God's grace. If you understood how much God has done for you and how much He sacrificed for you, it would cause you naturally to want to do anything He's asked you to do. And even if you're receiving persecution and pushback for it, if you meditate on that and think about that, you're going to be unstoppable. I think one of the biggest burdens that we have as Christians towards one another is helping one another know how good we have it. We live in an era that all of the people in the Old Testament longed to be able to experience. So Paul, he's motivated by God's grace. This is something that, speaking of his training program, he would tell Timothy the same thing. In 2 Timothy 2:1, you then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And in that same context, Paul tells Timothy that you have to work like a soldier, an athlete, and a farmer, all of these different kinds of strenuous labors that are for the benefit of other people. Even the athlete brings pride to the nation. And so, Timothy, this work you're doing is very difficult, but keep meditating and thinking about how good God has been for you. Now, what are you depending on? Are you depending on other people reciprocating kindness to you? Are you depending on building a legacy? Or is what you're thinking about is God's been good to me, I can do nothing else? What I want to show you are some examples of how this plays out in other passages in the Bible. When we talk about depending on God's grace, sometimes we can mean it in this way. The mental gymnastics of knowing that it's by Jesus' work that you're justified and it's not by your perfect obedience, but we still have to obey. So how does all of that work? That's not what I mean in this lesson. What I mean is tomorrow, when you're at work and you have opportunities to do good, how is it that God's grace motivates me in those smaller moments? Let me show you some examples. I'm going to give you just 3 examples of commands that the command is difficult, but wedged or wrapped into the commandment is God's grace that's supposed to motivate you to do it. So let me give you some examples. Hebrews 12:3. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. All right, now, some of the things that we're going to look at in the Gospels even today is going to show Jesus having hostility by these sinners that have issues with him. But the command in this passage is don't grow weary or faint-hearted. Have you ever struggled to grow weary or faint-hearted in the work that you're doing for the Lord? I mean, is it exhausting? All the things that are needed in a local church, all the things that other Christians are needing. This passage doesn't just say, don't grow weary. There's the motivation, we'll talk about that in a second. Do you remember during COVID, anybody struggle to grow weary or faint-hearted during COVID? I had to get off of social media because there was the mask and the no-mask Christians. And there was the vax and the no-vax Christians. And they were slinging mud at each other about and I was like, I can't see my brethren fighting like this. I've already had a lot of negativity in my own family for becoming a Christian. I hate seeing Christians fight like this. I'm done with social media. And so we can struggle for different reasons to not grow weary or faint-hearted. What's the motivation in this passage, though? Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself. What was some of the hostility that Jesus experienced in the Gospels? He was rejected by his family. How many of you have family members that are not Christians? Does that ever cause you to grow weary or faint-hearted and you're trying to talk to these people and they keep resisting and it keeps getting difficult? So don't grow weary. Well, how? Consider him. Jesus experienced the same thing. And he went through all of that so that he could be our Savior. Jesus was oftentimes misunderstood by somebody. Have you ever been misunderstood? You try to do a good deed for somebody, you try to send an encouraging text, and somebody just reads it in the worst way possible, and you're misunderstood. Jesus was misunderstood at times. In fact, we're going to see a story of that at 2 o'clock. And he kept doing the work that he did. Jesus, people were not always thankful to him. Do you remember that time when he healed those 10 lepers and only one of them came back and thanked him? And Jesus doesn't go, I'm not doing any, so, whoa, I didn't realize it was that loud. I'm not doing anything for anybody again because those people didn't thank me. I'm not holding the door open for anybody again because they didn't thank me. Don't grow weary or faint-hearted. You keep doing what you're doing, not because other people reciprocate, but because Jesus did this for you first. So that's the first instruction. Do you see how it's a hard command, but wrapped up into the command is God's grace? Here's another one. Ephesians 4:32. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. I think this is one of the hardest things that God commands. Every one of us has been a victim of sin. We've also made other people victims of our sin too, in different ways. But isn't this kind of dangerous for Paul to say this in a letter that's going to be circulated? I mean, Ephesians is one of those letters that is going to be preserved for 2,000 years, and we're quoting it right now, and there's churches probably across the country and the world right now studying it this morning. So Paul, why would you, in a public letter, just make a blanket statement that you better be forgiving, tender-hearted, being kind, all of that? Because certainly Paul wouldn't know all the circumstances of all the people that he's writing to. Unless this is just the truth. There's never a justification to be unkind, to be hard-hearted, and to not forgive somebody. And you think about people that have been hurt in deep, deep, deep ways. Trust has to be earned, but forgiveness is something that you give by God's grace. What's the motivation in this passage to be somebody who's forgiving? As God did it for you. You know what that means is if I'm going to have the power to forgive other people, I first have to meditate and stew and chew on what God has first done for me. Let me just say it this way, if I can say it bluntly. The unforgiving, bitter person is also an arrogant person. Do you know why? Because the unforgiving, bitter person thinks that the sins that have been done against them are much greater and much more severe than the sins that you've done against God. And if you were more in touch with what you've done against God, it would be easier and easier, though not always easy. I'm saying it would be easier and easier for you to be able to pour that out to other people. So if you're an unforgiving, bitter person, your problem is you don't understand God's grace and what He's done for you. If you're somebody that's growing weary and faint-hearted, you're not understanding what Jesus first did for you. Do you see how this principle works? Let me just give you one other example of this. 1 John 4:19. We love because He first loved us. Have you ever... What does love demand of somebody? My favorite definition of love is self-sacrifice for the benefit of somebody else. That I'm going to give up my time, my talents, my energy, whatever it might be that you need so that your life can be benefited and you can be uplifted spiritually. And that means that I'm going to have to sacrifice a lot. Remember in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He, what's the next word? Gave. What does love do? It gives. And so that's a high calling. What's going to motivate somebody to do that in this passage? Knowing that you were first loved. All right, let me tell you this. So when I was on my journey to becoming a Christian, I had some questions about the age of the earth and the story of Jonah and the story of Noah, and I was kind of wondering if these things could actually be true. And when I started with the premise that there is a God who's created everything and He can do whatever He wants with His creation, then it was easy for me to go, okay, well, if He created everything, He can tell the fish to do whatever He wants it to do. He can tell the rain to do whatever He wants it to do. Let me tell you the hardest thing for me to believe in the Bible, since I've become a Christian, and I've been a Christian for 17 years, still the hardest thing in the Bible for me to believe is that God loves me. Because I know the things that I've done. You know the things that you've done. Have you ever noticed how in 1 Corinthians 13, love is described as a person? Love is patient and kind. It's not rude, all those different things. Why does it describe it as a person? Because before you can ever be loving, it has to be something that you first experience. It has to be modeled for you. You know how deaf people can't talk? Why can't deaf people talk? Well, they have vocal cords that work, but they don't know how anything sounds. So if you're able to help somebody hear, they could learn how to talk more and more fluently. If you don't know what love, what it feels like, you're not going to be able to give it to anybody else. And so we love because he first loved us. Have you ever seen this happen before? I'll tell you a story of when I was in Nashville. And I'm not saying that this happens with everybody who's adopted. But there was a family in Nashville when I was training there that was attempting to adopt a 15-year-old from Ukraine. And so they're starting to have her into their home, and she's fighting them and arguing with them, and she's pushing back at everything they're trying to do. And the dad talks to me one day, and he goes, I don't get what's going on. We're doing everything for her. We're giving her everything she's ever wanted, and she's treating us like we're trash. You know what's going on? Everybody's let me down. Nobody's ever been there for me. Nobody's consistently loved me, and I'm going to push back and see how sincere you are. When I first became a Christian, I had a really hard time believing that anybody could actually love me with no ulterior motives. And you know, eventually what started happening the longer I was at church and around God's people is that people's genuine love calmed me down. And I went, okay, there's actually sincere people in this world. We love because he first loved us. The song, Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, this is not just a children's song. We need this song maybe even more than children do. But I could list out dozens of more instructions like this that have some high calling. Don't grow weary. Be forgiving. Love other people. And the motivation for all of these things is that God first did it for you. I want to show you a theme that is in the Gospels. Have you ever noticed the theme of all of the impossible commandments in the Gospels? I'm just going to isolate the Gospel of Mark for our purposes right now. That's all going to be on the PowerPoint. But there's times where Jesus will say something as if it's a command to somebody. And if anybody else were to say it, it would be an insult. So Jesus has Mr. Leper Man come up to him. And the way that it's stated in Mark, it's like an instruction. Be clean. Well, I can't. That's my whole problem. How can I, like a CGI moment in a movie, I'm suddenly made clean. Or he goes to Mr. Paralyzed Man. We're going to talk about this at 2 o'clock. Rise, take up your bed, and go home. Imagine that Mr. Paralyzed Man was right here in the aisle. And I came up to Mr. Paralyzed Man, and I said, hey, Mr. Paralyzed Man, get up and go home, but wait for the sermon to be over first. And he can't get up. I look like a jerk. I look like somebody who's mocking a paralyzed person. But when Jesus says it, he actually gives him the power to do it. What about Mr. Withered Hand Man? In Luke's account, it was his right hand. So Mr. Withered Hand Man, stretch out your hand. I can't. That's been my problem for a long time. Oh, I can because you told me to do it. Or he says to little Miss Dead Girl, little girl, I say to you, arise. Can you imagine going to an open casket funeral and you say, hey, little Miss Dead Girl, please get up. And everybody looks at you like you're a jerk. But instead, little Miss Dead Girl gets up. And then he also says in verse 43, give her something to eat. When people are given new life in the Lord, they need to keep eating. And then he tells the apostles in Mark 6, we got this giant crowd of people, and send them away, Jesus, because they need something to eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat, and it's not a joke. Who's the ones that actually distribute the food? Jesus provides the food, but who distributes it? The 12 apostles. By the way, how many baskets of food are left over after they do it? 12 baskets. Each one can hold it, and look that they have more left over than what they even started with. Do you see how in all of these instructions, you can't do it unless the instruction's coming from God. And he's going to give you the power to do it. So yesterday, Hannah and I have 4 kids, and I rotate which kid comes with me to gospel meetings. So I'm trying to be one of those preachers that don't neglect my kids and my family so they get good one-on-one time and all that. So yesterday was a 9-hour car ride. And Hannah really did a good job with all of it. But I got pretty exhausted. So there's one point where I said to Hannah, I need you to drive the rest of the way. And she said, Dad, I can't do that. And I said, I'm taking away all of your toys if you don't, no. Because a godly parent, somebody who's trying to reflect God, is not going to give some kind of instruction that they know the kid can't do. God won't tell us to do something that He's not going to give us the strength by His grace to accomplish. Which means that with anything God has commanded you to do, if you failed to do it, you don't really have an excuse. But if you have failed to do it, He will empower you to help you. So I want to ask this question. How do we grow in spiritual strength? There's a couple things to say about this. First one is to seek humility. I used to have this idea when I was a new Christian that humility means that I tell myself how much of a loser I am, and I just keep talking down about myself. And that was my impression when I was a new Christian. So I'm like, okay, well, I do stink at everything I do. And I'm humble, but it really hurts to be humble. That's not the idea of humility in the Bible. The idea of humility in the Bible is that you're not obsessed with yourself. And by the way, if you think that you're a really great person and you always talk about that to yourself, that's pride. But if you're always telling yourself how much of a loser and a failure you are, guess what? You're still obsessed with yourself. To be humble means that you're not self-obsessed, whether it's high or low. So when Paul talks about, it doesn't mean that you're unaware of things about yourself. Paul talks in this passage about how he worked harder than the other apostles, but he says, even though he worked harder than the other apostles, look at what he says in verse 9, the verse before that. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. I worked harder than any of them, but I'm the least of them. I don't deserve anything that I have. Do you remember let me say it this way. Paul never forgot where he came from. He never forgot where he came from. Do you remember that scene in Ezekiel 16 where the nation of Israel is metaphorically depicted as this baby that was left on the side of the road for dead? And nobody else cared about this baby on the side of the road until God passed by her and He said, I said to you in your blood, live. And it says it 2 times. I said to you in your blood, live. And because of God's words, this infant started to grow and thrive and flourish until she became at the age for marriage, and God passed by her again, and He spread His wings over her, and He entered into a covenant with her, which is kind of a depiction of God taking them out of Egypt and bringing them to Mount Sinai and giving them all these blessings. And then He makes her beautiful. He gives her gold. He gives her the nicest food. He gives her the nicest of clothing. And now she's become beautiful. And all of those nations that neglected and rejected her when she was a baby on the side of the road, oh, that's a baby and I need to give attention to that and that's going to require me to love. Well, now she's older and she's beautiful. And what does she do with this beauty that was given to her by God? She starts cheating on God, which in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament is a way of depicting that the nation of Israel started worshiping idols and false gods. They were cheating on God. And you might think in all of that, well, what was she thinking that she did all of that? And I think really the better question to ask is, what was she not thinking? In Ezekiel 16, 22, 23, somewhere around there, it says, in all of your whorings and abominations, you did not remember the days of your youth when you were wallowing in your blood. You forgot where you came from. What does it mean to have a good memory? A lot of people will think, well, having a good memory means you can quote book, chapter, and verse. And that's great as long as you have it, but age will probably take that away eventually, so don't boast about it too much. What does it mean biblically to have a good memory? It means that you never forget where you came from. When I was a new Christian in Minnesota, there was it was the first Sunday that I came to church. I was baptized on April 3rd, 2008 on a Thursday. And then I went to church Sunday night because I had a job where I worked Sunday mornings for the first few months of being a Christian until I changed my schedule. So I came Sunday night, and there was a family that came up to me, and they said, "We're so happy that you've been baptized, and we'd like to have lunch with you sometime." And this is what my face looked like. I went, "Yeah, that sounds great." And in my heart, I was thinking, what kind of cult is this that people from church would hang out with each other? I'd never heard about people from church hanging out with each other. That's strange. And so I was like, in the car, I was like, people are really nice, but maybe kind of too nice. I don't know what's wrong with these people, what they're trying to get from me, I don't know. And so I eventually had lunch with these people, and they became some of our closest friends when we were there. They remember answering all of my basic questions about the Bible. I didn't know anything about the Bible. It would go to lunch with them at their house. They'd make this really nice lunch for us whenever we would come. And then I moved down to San Diego, to Nashville. And Samantha and I get married. We moved down to Nashville there. And I'm training to preach. And we're on a vacation in Minnesota before we're going to move to San Diego, because that's where we're going to go after the training program. So we're at this person's house again, just catching up with them. They're asking how things are going. And I find out on this trip that we're going to San Diego sooner than what was originally planned. And I go, yay, I'm so excited, and I'm going to go out to that church and everything. And this woman, her name is Joan Elder. I don't know if any of you know her. Joan just kind of logs that in her mind. And while Samantha and I are driving back to Nashville, she sends me a Facebook message that says, "Hey, Eric, I'm really excited about your opportunity to go to San Diego. And I know that you're excited to be the guy when you're there in California. But I just want you to know that there are people in this world who remember where you came from. And I remember when you didn't know a thing about the Bible. I remember when you'd come to church crying because your family was pummeling you all the time. And I want you to know that when you get there, that you better not get a hot head." You know what happens sometimes with Christians? Is that, before I was ever saved, I just kind of needed a minor tune-up. Like I was watching R-rated movies, and now I throttled it back to PG-13, and I'm trying to be a better person. But I didn't need a whole lot of change. And then years go by, and you've become more loving, and you've become more gentle. And then people go, "You're pretty impressive," and you go, "Yeah, I sure am. Thank you for noticing." And you start to forget that it's God that's changed you. And you start to whore around, and you put other things above God. And God's not your biggest passion anymore. Paul says, "I worked harder than any of the other apostles. I never got hot-headed about it because I never forgot where I came from." Have you ever seen a spoiled brat before? Somebody that was born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Why is it not a golden spoon? Because gold's better. I don't know. But it's like this kid has been given everything that they've ever needed. And then they're self-absorbed, spoiled brats. Did you know that if you see a spoiled brat that you are frustrated with, you might be looking into a mirror? Spiritually speaking, has God done everything that you've needed? But if we don't lift a finger to serve Him in His kingdom, we might be spoiled brats spiritually, forgetting where we've come from. Here's some questions that we could ask ourselves to see if we're growing in humility. How do I respond to criticism? Am I the kind of person that if anybody ever has anything to say, no matter how gently even they say it, I just freak out, and I've learned that that's a good self-defense mechanism so that I don't have to have anybody tell me anything I need to hear. Somebody who's humble receives criticism with thankfulness. Do I compare myself to people or to God? Do you know, you can feel really good about yourself psychologically if you compare yourself to people who are worse than you. Remember in Luke 18 where you've got the tax collector and the Pharisee, and they go up to the temple to pray? And does the Pharisee have a pretty good sense of self-worth and ego? I mean, I look at all the things, I'm not like that guy over there. I've heard that even in prisons, if you've murdered one person, you look down on the people who've murdered 5 people. So this is something that everybody does. We can find people that are worse than us. All right, how about, let's just illustrate it like this. What time am I supposed to be done, by the way? 10:15? Yeah. Okay, all right, I got it. Imagine that somebody's on the top of Mount Everest. And then they get their binoculars out and they look down at somebody who's at the bottom of Mount Everest and they go, ha 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 ha, I'm closer to the moon than you are. Well, guess what? You're both really far away. And if we find other people that we think we're better than, me and that person are probably still pretty far away from the image of God. So if I compare myself to God, I'm going to be oriented properly. Do I regularly tell people my accomplishments? I don't think I need to say much about that one. Am I thankful to God? Does it actually just pour out of my heart? Am I working hard for God? Going back to what Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, God's been good to me. I'll endure persecutions. I'll keep establishing churches. Maybe that's not the work that we're doing. But could we say that this is the work that I am doing, and it's because I'm fueled by God's grace? All right, so those are just some questions that you could ask yourself. Here's a second thing for growing in spiritual strength, is to preach to yourself. Martin Lloyd-Jones was a Welsh preacher, and I don't agree with everything he taught on how to be saved and all of that, but he wrote a book called, he used to be a doctor, a physician, and he became a preacher. So in his preaching, he approaches texts of the Bible like a doctor would. So he wrote a book called Spiritual Depression, Its Causes and Its Cures. And in the book, he is writing about Psalm 42 and 43. Now, if you don't know Psalm 42 and 43, they're two psalms that go together. And the writers of Psalm 42 and 43, they're going through a really hard time in their life. And I want to show you what Martin Lloyd-Jones says about this, what's going on in Psalm 42 and 43. Have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? Take those thoughts that come to you the moment you wake up in the morning. You have not originated them, but they start talking to you. They bring back the problems of yesterday. Who is talking to you? Yourself is talking to you. Now, there's going to be more to say about this in a second. But do you relate to this? You wake up in the morning and go, yeah, politics. Or you wake up and go, yeah, the price of gold is going up. Or you wake up and you don't even want to think about it, but there's all these things that you got to fix in your house or your car, and you're worried about this and you're worried about that. You didn't choose to think about that, but it just kind of seems to crash in on you. And it's depressing. So what Martin Lloyd-Jones does in the next quote is he keeps talking about what the writers of Psalm 42 and 43 do to handle moments of trial and difficulty. Now this man, the one who wrote the psalm, this man's treatment was this. Instead of allowing this self to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. And what's quoted next is what's quoted 3 times in Psalm 42. Why art thou cast down, O my soul, he asks. He's quoting from the King James. You get the joke? All right. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, self, listen for a moment. I will speak to you. You must turn on yourself, upbraid yourself, condemn yourself, exhort yourself, and say to yourself, hope thou in God, which is what they say 3 times, instead of muttering in this depressed, unhappy way. And then you must go on to remind yourself of God, who God is, and what God is, and what God has done, and what God has pledged himself to do. How much of our life would be different if we did what the writers of Psalm 42 and 43 did? I'm surrounded by enemies. I got all these things to worry about. And I just keep muttering to myself about these things. And then they say 3 times, why is my soul cast down? And then hope in God. I'm going to challenge myself. I'm going to actually talk to myself and control these things that keep coming into my mind. I'm going to preach truths to myself. Everybody here has been around church long enough where you know the truths that would calm you down. The challenge is whether or not you're going to tell yourself. Okay, so I'm 36 years old. If I do 36 times 365, I've been alive for over 13,000 days, but I'm worried about tomorrow. Do the math for your own age and learn to preach to yourself. God's taking care of me all these days leading up to now. Or we've been told in the news to worry about this and to worry about that, but I'm still here and things are ultimately okay. Trust in God. He's got this. Do you think if I reminded myself of these things, that it would help me and I would find more strength by the grace of God? Do you think next time I'm tempted to be unforgiving, if I preached the truth to myself, that God forgave me. Or the next time I'm tempted to grow weary or faint-hearted, if I preached the truth to myself. Or the next time I'm tempted to not love somebody else, if I preached the truth to myself that God loved me first. I think the lives of Christians everywhere would be dramatically different. What are you relying on? The strength that comes from God, or the hope of a reputation or earthly glory? We're gonna add more to the mix of all this as we start looking at scenes in the Gospels beginning in the next session. But thank you so much for your good attention and for the comments whenever we had something to discuss. I'm done.